We now have our final three presenters on the panel on alternative development and land use practices, innovation and health. And I would like to present to you the moderator of the panel, Bernadette Hanlon. Bernadette is Assistant Professor of City and Regional Planning here at Knowlton. She comes to us from Dublin, Ireland, by way of Baltimore. And her books, Once the American Dream and Cities and Suburbs, New Metropolitan Realities, both focus on issues of suburban growth and decline. Bernadette will be moderating this panel. Welcome to the podium, Bernadette.
Hello, everyone. Hope everyone can hear me, yeah? In the back? We're good? Okay, we're going to start this afternoon's panel, which is Alternative Development and Land Use Practices, Innovation and Health. I'm going to start with Brian Holland, and we're delighted to have Brian back here after his fellowship with OSU back in 2009-2010. And Brian is an architect and educator. He's living in Brooklyn, New York. He's an assistant director of Institute New York, or NY. And he's interested, I'm going to talk a little bit today about some of these alternative strategies that we've talked a little bit about from a design perspective. And so we're delighted to have Brian here today. And we'll do the same as what we've done before. We'll hold off for questions at the very end of the panel, and then we'll hopefully have a nice discussion. Okay, with that, I'll welcome Brian.
Thank you, Bernadette. I'm very happy to be back here at the Knowlton School. So, let me just set my timer so I don't get carried away. Okay. So first, as Bernadette said, I'm an architect and an educator of architects. And so I'm approaching the subject of urban agriculture through that lens. I have a deep interest in cities and how we imagine cities and the kinds of spaces we build for cities. And I have also an interest in the relationship with nature and how we consider it as part of our built environment in the city. And so urban agriculture has been a topic I've been interested in for 7 or 8 years now when I first encountered it as a graduate student, actually working on a project in Rome. And so it's been an on and off research topic of mine for many years. And I've had the opportunity to study the relationship between agriculture, agricultural systems, and agricultural spaces in the city in several different places, including Ohio, happily here for a one-year fellowship, but also in Beirut, Lebanon, and also now in New York City, where I've resided for the past 5 or 6 years. So that's what I'm here to talk to you about today, about some experiments in agriculture in New York City. And I think what I'm excited to hear, at least in the discussion later, is we've heard so much about Detroit, some of the contrasts that I can see in what's going on in New York City as compared to Detroit and many other cities. And what I want to talk about is, I think, some of the core conceptual projects behind these different experiments and how we conceive of the place of agriculture in the city. So, let's see. Here we go. So, New York is one of many cities at the forefront of innovation in the field of urban agriculture today. The city has a long history of community gardens, and in the past few years, several exciting firsts have occurred here, or have occurred there. First and largest rooftop soil farms, first commercial rooftop farms, first rooftop commercial greenhouses in the US, and the first rooftop greenhouses to be integrated with a grocery store to open in the next few months. It's also, many of these farms, I should say, are in Brooklyn, and Brooklyn is, of course, also a hipster haven. So as we've heard before today, hipsters love urban agriculture, among other things. So there's a huge culture built around the idea of farming and food in New York. So these ideas fall on very fertile soil. So projects like this one, a 1-acre rooftop farm called Brooklyn Grange, have generated widespread enthusiasm in the city. Consequently, popular awareness of and public support for urban agriculture have grown dramatically. There have also recently been important changes in zoning and use to support agriculture in the city, changes to maximum height limits to allow for urban agriculture, including green roofs, as well as commercial greenhouses on rooftops, and various experiments in rooftop leasing and tenancy, and new production, processing, and distribution models. And importantly for this last panel of the day, these projects for me are suggestive of an emerging land use strategy which I will call piggybacking. I will also argue that these new farming projects represent a new conceptual project for urban agriculture as compared to what I think are two earlier appearances during this past century, and that this speaks to the ever-changing motivations of those who farm in the city. So to first start with just simply a description of a few case studies from New York that I think are particularly important. The first one being Eagle Street Rooftop Farm. It's in Greenpoint, which is in Brooklyn, and it is a 6,000 square foot rooftop farm. It's soil-based. It's a lightweight engineered soil, and it was built in 2008 or 2009 above the Broadway Stages warehouse. So Broadway Stages is a sound stage. There's a whole network of sound stages in that part of Brooklyn, and this one in particular is very activist-oriented in terms of trying to build connections with the community and explore mechanisms of sustainability. On one roof, they have a whole array of solar panels, and on this roof, they have basically decided to host this rooftop farm. It was the first soil farm in the city, and it was not conceived of as a for-profit farm, but rather as it's a nonprofit, so it's an experiment in whether or not rooftop soil farm was even viable as a technical project. So the model is basically they rely on a lot of volunteer labor, which they have the advantage of a site like this where they can, with open Sundays, a lot of people would love to come and spend a few hours on the rooftop working with an amazing group of people to develop this farm. They sell direct to consumers at a farmer's market, but mostly they sell direct to restaurants, to high-end restaurants, and so they grow a wide variety of high-value crops, specialty vegetables, and they have a whole array of practices, including beekeeping that supports pollination of the farm. So the farm is actually run by a woman named Annie Novak, who is also the head gardener at the New York Botanical Gardens. So it's sort of tied in with that project. So this was a kind of first experiment that was quite successful and generated a lot of interest. And it spun off a second project, a much larger project, headed by Ben Flanner, who was involved in the Eagle Street rooftop farm. And this is Brooklyn Grange again. So the Brooklyn Grange farm is a 1-acre farm. It's 43,000 square feet. It's a soil-based commercial farm again. It was built in 2010. And it's constructed on top of the Standard Motor Products building, which is now housing a multi-tenant creative businesses below in about 6 or 7 stories, actually in Long Island City. So it has a 10-year rooftop lease of the building, and the funding was mixed between private equity loans and crowdsourcing. It is a for-profit commercial farm. In the first year, they managed to break even. In the second year, they turned a small profit, and I think they're doing even better this year. This was their third season. They also do a lot of other things. They experiment. They have in a space that they can perform a lot of different experiments, including they have a hoop house. And I was interested to see the extent to which they use a lot of staking because of the high winds up at the 7th floor. Any plant that grows above a few inches needs to really be staked. So this is one of the things that they're learning. They also have a really amazing market on Saturdays, and that's also the sort of open farm day. And they also use a lot of volunteer, but they do have a core team of employees who actually work very hard to keep this farm running. And they also have a cafe down at the street level in the building where they serve what is one of the most amazing pure greens salad I've ever eaten. But they use the rooftop in many other ways as well, and it's important actually as part of their revenue stream. So they don't just support themselves with the selling of their produce, but they use the rooftop for as an events venue. Again, they have this amazing skyline view, which certainly helps for that, but also just the scale and scope of this agricultural landscape in the middle of the city is appealing for many different events. They also run a green roof consulting business as part of their endeavor. They run training internships and school and refugee programs as well. So it's a whole package of programs that they run. And then last year, 2012, they expanded to a third. Well, this would be their second location in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which is again larger. It is 65,000 square feet, so about an acre and a half. And one thing that's interesting here is this one is not as open to the public. It's a bit harder to get to, but I think they focus purely on production. Here, they have a market on Wednesdays, I believe, and then most of the public outreach happens at their other location. So one thing that's interesting about this is that one of their major funding sources was the DEP's Green Infrastructure Stormwater Management Initiative. So that's basically, because this is a green roof, the roof serves to retain the stormwater runoff, which is an important issue, especially for New York City, where most of the city has what are called CSOs, which you may have heard about, combined sewer overflows, where during a huge downpour, sewage mixes with the stormwater and runs off into the waterways. So projects like this and green roofs in general help mitigate that. And they actually have a 20-year rooftop lease here at the Navy Yard. So then switching gears slightly to another and also very important project in the city is called Gotham Greens. And it's slightly different, or considerably different actually. It's a rooftop hydroponic commercial greenhouse. It's 15,000 square feet and it was built in 2011 above the Greenpoint Wood Exchange warehouse, not too far from the Eagle Street rooftop farm. One of its founders here on the right is Jennifer Nelkin, who's the head farmer. And their model is direct sales to high-end restaurants as well as high-end markets and grocers, and their primary buyer is Whole Foods. Here's the interior of the greenhouse, which operates largely based off hydroponics. So this is a picture of a detail of the system, the nutrient film technique. Doesn't use soil, and plants grow very efficiently and very rapidly with this system. They do rainwater capture on the site, so and they also have an array of solar panels. So they're very interested in sort of creating as much of a closed loop as they can. The project actually grew out of an experiment that this group, New York Sunworks, did in 2007 in the city, where they built on a barge a very small version of what would become Gotham Greens, a hydroponic greenhouse that had also solar panels and wind turbines and biodiesel, I believe, and where it was a sort of proof of concept, where they were really testing to see if this could work, if this was viable, but as well as doing a lot of public outreach, and school groups would come through this, and they would actually float the barge all over the city to come to people where they were. That expanded out into what you see on the right, which is a rooftop greenhouse built atop PS 333 on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, which is their sort of flagship school greenhouse program, where they demonstrate. It's an integral part of a science education program. That's an interior of that greenhouse at PS 333. So here's Viraj Puri, one of the founders of Gotham Greens, and you can see their facility on the right. So this is a different model. This is a commercial model that we're quite familiar with. Even the greenhouse technology is a proven technology, but this is the first time that we're seeing it built on a rooftop in the middle of New York. And it's interesting to always look at how a project like this markets itself, and they've been fortunate to have Whole Foods as a major customer. And one of the interesting things that's happened with all of the interest in Gotham Green's first greenhouse is that they actually got Whole Foods to invite them to their new store, which is about to open in Gowanus Canal in Brooklyn. So they're building Gotham Greens 2 on top of a new Whole Foods. So it's an interesting model, and the question that I have is how much the spaces of the greenhouse or awareness of the greenhouse will be present to shoppers at Whole Foods. That's yet to be determined. Okay, so in terms of these projects, their rooftop locations are clearly what make them possible. A primary advantage of the rooftop, of course, is its horizontality, facilitating solar access, rainwater capture, and deployment of crops. But in an expensive city like New York, the rooftop also serves as an essential land value offset. Economically, the farm does not have to perform to a level that would fully offset the cost of the land on which it sits. This would frankly be impossible. So this is a detail of a map by the Urban Design Lab at Columbia University's Earth Institute, where they started to survey possible available agricultural land in New York. They looked at different types of land. This map in particular is a map of rooftops. The different colors of blue represent buildings that are either underbuilt or built to maximum FAR, so buildings that could be built taller or not. And they've already gone through and isolated out certain buildings that are unsuitable, and they've focused on buildings built during a certain period of time in the 20th century, which tend to have more robust structures that could support rooftop constructions. So, and then the red circles I've added to the map, which indicate the location of the top four are the projects I just showed you, and the bottom two are the soon-to-open Gotham Greens Whole Foods, as well as another project from another group called Bright Farms, which I haven't showed you, which is yet again another greenhouse rooftop project. So there's something going on in Brooklyn for sure. And here's just a detail of Long Island City to see how their level of analysis, the Urban Design Lab's analysis, goes to specific buildings and starts to understand which neighborhoods in particular have these large buildings with robust structures that could be potential rooftop farmland. So, piggybacking. What do I mean by this? So let's go to the basic definition. So the first definition by Merriam-Webster is to carry up on the shoulders and back. So this describes clearly a literal spatial positioning, a lifting. This is definitely true in the case of a rooftop farm, obviously. Not much new here. New York has been about lifting multiple uses since its inception. And the architect Rem Koolhaas has written much on this subject. Definition 2, though, tells us more. So piggybacking can also mean to haul as a truck trailer by a railroad car. So here we have, piggyback transport, we have the train carrying the stacked storage containers, or more interestingly perhaps, the now retired space shuttle. Whenever it would land in California, the space shuttle being unpowered couldn't fly back on its own power to Florida, where it would launch. So they would stick it on the back of a modified jumbo jet and fly it back to Florida. So this particular definition of piggybacking implies a literal carrying, but more importantly, to provide an assist. It facilitates greater performance than otherwise would be possible with one entity alone. So the shuttle can't make it on its own. It requires a piggyback onto another mode of transport. So this, I would argue, is also the case with these particular kinds of urban agriculture projects. So they couldn't do it alone in the city, but they're being sort of carried forward in the way I've described. But in the third definition, I think, is the more interesting one. To set up or cause to function in conjunction with something larger, more important, or already in existence and operation. This, for me, is the key definition. And it starts to suggest perhaps species partnerships, opportunism, mutualism, or networked ecologies. And in the case of a rooftop farm, this could be a material ecology, shared benefits. For example, the farm here on the rooftop in the Brooklyn Navy Yard offers insulation to the building below, maintaining a more stable temperature and reducing the heat load or cooling load of the building. It offers stormwater control or urban heat island reduction. Or here, in the case of the PS1 Public Farm 1 party of several years ago, it also implies a programmatic piggybacking. It combines urban farm with summer dance party. So this is, I think, one of the interesting ways to think about this notion of piggybacking relative to urban agriculture. So I want to now step back and put these few projects I've just shown you into a larger context of New York's many community farms and gardens. This was also a map by the Urban Design Lab, mapping all of the existing community gardens, farms, and other agricultural spaces in the city. So you can see there's actually a lot of space devoted to the growing of food in New York City. And the size of the circle represents their scale, relative scale. This is an interesting project called the 5-Borough Farm Project, which has recently done a survey of all of these existing farms, mapped them, analyzed them, talked to various gardeners, farmers, stakeholders, and tried to identify a whole series of issues, basically collecting information and starting to generate policy recommendations relative to an understanding of what's actually happening now in the city. And they've classified all of these existing farm spaces in New York into what are 4 types of farms. And that's institutional farms and gardens, commercial farms, community gardens, and community farms. And you can see, by and large, the largest number of farms are either institutional farms and gardens, and that's New York City Housing Authority gardens or public schools or community gardens. So, and there we have, you can see the red projects are the rooftop projects. But what I wanted to do is look at that relative to the Urban Design Lab's map of public vacant lands. And then also, you can see a pretty strong correspondence between those. But then also, importantly, I think, to map those spaces against the median income of the census districts in New York. And there, I think, is where you see the most clear connection. And this is where I think we can understand this idea of vacancy as a huge part of this issue of how the community gardens and farms developed in New York City. And I'll come back to that a little bit. I don't think I need to linger too long on this quick sort of survey of some of the existing community farms and gardens in the city. It's very similar to a lot of the things we've been seeing earlier today, but this is East New York Farms, which grows an amazingly diverse variety of foods, echoing the diversity of its residents, as well as the Red Hook Community Farm. The Hell's Kitchen Farm Project on the left, which is a project by the Metro Baptist Church in Midtown, and then the Seeds to Feed Rooftop Farm on the right, which is part of a supportive housing facility. So Now, if we compare these community gardens with the new breed of rooftop farms that I opened with, it becomes clear that they are somewhat differently motivated. The institutional and community farms and gardens are oriented primarily toward community development, education, and social justice, as we've been hearing today so far, addressing issues like health, wellness, nutrition, and economic opportunity. Now, these new rooftop commercial farms are oriented primarily toward scaled production and environmental sustainability. For me, these differing agendas point to the very basic question of why do we farm in the city? I think that's a crucial question to understand as a designer if we're starting to think about incorporating agricultural space in the city. Why would we do this, and for what reasons? Then how would we do it? But before I develop this further, I want to briefly step back and examine one set of precedents from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I'll do this briefly because we've seen them already last night. The first is Ebenezer Howard's proposal for the Garden City Town planning concept of 1898. Howard's idea was intended to present an alternative to the pollution and overcrowding of the 19th century city by planning a balance between town and country, between agricultural and urban land uses. Frank Lloyd Wright's project for Broadacre City was similar in some respects, but organized instead around the idea of the individual American farmstead. In Wright's proposal, each individual dwelling would be paired with a single acre of private farmland. As a land use proposition, Broadacre City is not so much a city as a modern agricultural town, integrally dependent because of its horizontal extension on the automobile to tie its residents together and to their places of business. The importance here for Wright was not the presence of agriculture as an occupation or livelihood, but as a spiritual presence, but rather the spiritual presence of the agricultural landscape. This was indicative of Wright's philosophical opposition to the modern metropolis. So in my view, these two proposals are representative of a larger theoretical project which advocates for the use of urban agricultural landscape as a corrective for pollution, overcrowding, and lack of open space. So I'd like to posit this as the first significant manifestation of modern urban agriculture, that is, agriculture against the crisis of the modern city. This is a project that is very much in sympathy with the great civic parks and town plans of Frederick Law Olmsted, and even to some degree to Le Corbusier's conceptualization of green space as an essential part of the modern city. As a planning strategy, this is simple but problematic. I'll come back. Setting aside land in the heart of the city for dedicated agricultural use didn't succeed to any great degree, at least in America during this period, for a number of reasons. Chief among them were comparatively high land values, availability of inexpensive long-distance transport, and eventually the so-called green revolution of fossil fuel-driven farming. But also, in some sense, due to the modern notions of progress and development, which are opposed to traditional rural life. In short, we wanted the landscapes without the agriculture, without the hard work. So this now leads us back to our map of New York's farms in relation to median income. Here the story is different. This is, in many cases, urban farming for those for whom the modern project had failed. The dark green neighborhoods here, the ones with the community farms and gardens in red, the South Bronx, East Harlem, the Lower East Side, and large parts of Brooklyn. These neighborhoods in particular were devastated by New York's fiscal crisis of the 1970s and by the loss of urban jobs associated with larger suburban post-industrial transformation of the economy. It's a lot of what we've been hearing about today. So here farming entered in as a necessity, as a means of food security and opportunity, a way to build community in the face of decline. And this was not just limited to New York, of course. Here's a similar map which I've shown before of Columbus, Ohio, evidencing the same correlation. So this is for me the second big manifestation of modern urban agriculture. That is, urban agriculture as a corrective for the crisis of the modern economy. As green space and food, yes, but primarily as a community building project. As a land use strategy, this is about remediation and adaptive reuse. In New York, the community garden movement grew up in the 70s as a bottom-up alternative to Robert Moses' top-down approach to the planning of New York City's parks. Thanks to the pioneering grassroots efforts of Liz Christie and the Green Guerrillas, here shown on the right, among many others, dozens of acres of community gardens are now held in public land trust. much of which is used to grow food. So this then brings us back to where I started, with the new generation of commercial rooftop farms. As I alluded to in the beginning, these projects are notable not only for their use of the rooftop, but primarily for their claims toward environmental sustainability and healthier farming practices. These are the stated objectives of an innovative greenhouse farm in Montreal called Loofah Farms. Local, healthier, pesticide-free, some of the things also we've been hearing about today. Clearly, this is a sustainability project. In my way of looking at it, this is now the third distinct manifestation of modern urban agriculture. That is, urban agriculture now reframed as a corrective for the modern environmental crisis. Against the environmental degradations of the modern industrial food system, petrochemical fertilizers and pesticides, long-distance global transport, and associated use of food preservatives, as well as destructive land use practices. These rooftop farms deploy organic, pesticide-free farming practices, and perhaps more importantly in this case, create hyper-local food production systems, along with local processing and distribution. This is localism taken to its extreme, virtually eliminating their product's carbon footprint. So, to briefly recap, at least as I'm framing it here, we have the first manifestation of modern urban agriculture, agriculture against the crisis of the modern city. The inclusion of agricultural landscapes as a new way of planning for healthier cityscapes. The second manifestation, agriculture against the crisis of the modern economy, community gardens, organizing grassroots efforts to help build healthier communities in the face of economic devastation. And this new third manifestation, urban agriculture against the modern environmental crisis, local, commercial-scale farming, making claims toward healthier ecologies. As land use strategies, these represent in turn the master plan, landscape and new town planning, remediation and adaptive reuse, and now, at least as I propose, piggybacking as a new incremental and contingent approach to rooftops and other territories. Now we might ask, why is it exactly that agriculture keeps coming forward as a means to alleviate these multiple crises? I do think it speaks perhaps, while it is somewhat nostalgic and romantic, I do think it speaks perhaps to a lingering sense of collective dislocation from the agricultural landscape, a process that began in earnest as the Industrial Revolution picked up steam in the 18th and 19th centuries. After all, before the modern industrial and post-industrial metropolis, our landscapes were agriculturally based, our economies were agriculturally based, and our ecologies were agriculturally based. And of course, this project of dislocation is ongoing. In China, for example, at a staggering pace. I should also note that I don't mean to imply any notion of dialectical progression with each form of agriculture emerging to replace the previous as some kind of linear development, only that these two crises have emerged sequentially, along with their subsequent agricultural responses. These crises coexist today throughout the world in different ways and to varying degrees, and will only continue to intensify as urbanization intensifies globally. I do believe urban farming can play a part in alleviating this triple crisis, but we need to be smart about planning and design. The reason I think this framing is important, urban agriculture as a means to healthier cityscapes, healthier communities, and healthier ecologies, is that I think they become an important metric for measuring the merits of various planning and design strategies. So given the work that is underway to quantify potential new territory for rooftop and other kinds of agriculture, and given the limitations of space in the city, we need to think critically about what our objectives might be. We need to be smart about what sorts of projects we promote, smart about how we design for urban agricultural use. A big question here, again, another map by Urban Design Lab, with the rooftop space being identified in blue. You can see in Brooklyn or Queens alone, it rivals the size of Central Park, here shown to scale, is to who that space becomes available if it is indeed to be farmed. So the more any single agricultural project in the city can address each of these three issues I've identified, cityscape, community, and ecology, the more robust it will be. So in closing, with that in mind, I'm trying to look past some of the initial enthusiasm around commercial greenhouse projects like Loofah Farms or Gotham Greens. I do find them to be compelling, but also somewhat problematic, and I'll be curious to hear your reactions. This is Lufa Farm's first rooftop greenhouse, but their second building is about to come online. For this project, they partnered with a Dutch greenhouse builder and a developer of suburban industrial parks to piggyback atop a new industrial park development. And I'm concerned about the direction that this is headed, concerned with the end logic of controlled environment agriculture as a new type of urban development, and making available the spaces of the city, as well as funding, in the case of Gotham Green's $900,000 of research grants to support the creation of new rooftop greenhouses in New York City that this suggests. So, to me, as a landscape, this is bleak. Its social and economic benefits skew more toward the interests of capital than the interests of community. Ecology may perhaps be its strong suit, but still it skews toward the single variable optimizations of modern planning. Problematic notions of technological control that I previously addressed in critical readings of the related project for the so-called vertical farm. I'm also troubled by the tendency in consumer-oriented projects like these that suggest we might solve our environmental problems by technological means alone, without the need for corresponding cultural shifts. Our only need for participation, as was mentioned before, with projects like these is with our paycheck, or with our whole paycheck, as KB said last night. So perhaps the single most compelling reason for promoting urban agriculture is that more and more people are now living in cities, and more people are now expressing an interest in food, and in many cases, an interest in farming. But this is also a generation that has grown up in the city. They want to farm, but they also want to live in cities. People like Annie Novak here, the lead farmer at Eagle Street, and the director of the vegetable gardening program at Botanical Gardens, have created here a much more compelling use of rooftop space that engages each of the three issues I've spoken about. It is a project about community building, stewardship, and participation, and it is creating healthier local urban ecologies. So the kinds of community it creates may be considerably different than many other community farms and gardens do, but the opportunities are also different, and equally important in changing our expectations of the urban landscape and our relationship with each other and with the environment. So in closing, for me, the big question is, how will piggybacking develop as a land use strategy in support of the expansion of urban agriculture? Will it become primarily a technical project, mechanically optimizing input and output flows according to the reductive logic of consumer-driven capitalism? Or will we be able to leverage the collective social capital of the community gardening project to plan for and design new urban landscapes and new opportunities for cultural engagement and transformation? Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Our next speaker, I'm delighted, is our very own Katherine Bennett, who's an assistant professor in the landscape architecture program here at OSU. So I'm delighted that she's here to speak. And I've had the pleasure of working with Katherine on some of this work that she's been doing in Wylam Park, so I'm looking forward to her talk. Katherine is very interested in interspecies cohabitation and adaptation to climate change within the framework of political ecology. And Katherine has an interesting presentation, I'm sure, that's building on some of her sort of more critical perspectives on some of the design issues around alternative land use strategies. So with that, I'll welcome Katherine.
Thank you for doing that, Richard. Hello. In spite of my earlier sort of potentially interpreted as snarky academic question to Julie, I'm going to possibly give one of the more academic-y presentations of today, so any perceived snarkiness could be turned right back on me. It's part of what I'm told to do in tracking job security in a university. And as we have heard much about today, job security is, of course, related to food security. So that's a relationship I can draw as well. So I will also be talking about how my research into social theory informs my work as a landscape architect and designer, and also instructor here in the Knowlton School. This title, Homes and Gardens, Negotiating Architectures of Inclusion in Columbus, Ohio, is actually a working title for a paper that I'm in process of writing, theorizing this project, which some of you were kind enough to come and see yesterday, and thank you very much for coming. My actual name for that project, I want to say here, is Modular Habitat, and I could see another paper title, Homes and Gardens, Modular Habitats, because like some of our earlier speakers, I was very interested to hear Michael Hamm and Alison Blake-Palmer and others speaking about the issue of scale. And my interest in modularity as a designer and coming out of an architectural tradition is in this kind of thinking about scale. Certain social geographers have written about scale, even contesting its hierarchical configurations. I know that the way it's used as a tool in my own discipline of landscape architecture can certainly be hierarchical, and I'm interested in exploring that, although I'm not yet prepared to talk about that today. So the Modular Habitat Project reconsiders terms and forms of home in the low-density urban context of Ohio's capital city of Columbus, my present home also. The modular habitats consist of redesigned plastic hoop house, others have called them today high tunnel, I like the term hoop house for a reason, structures, and raised beds for vegetable and fruit gardening. They're homes for plants, pollinating insects, worms, and soil microbes. The project questions norms of residential redevelopment implicit in much of the current discourse on urban agriculture. Redevelopment and agriculture share not-so-new problems of class, race, and gender in relation to property, and we've heard much, at least, about the race and class issues today. I want to argue for architectures of home that can dislodge some of the accepted exclusionary boundaries between species, scales, and opportunities ascribed to the act of living in space. My concerns are political and environmental, as Bernadette alluded to, stretching between social structures and their materialization in the architecture of this redevelopment project in progress in Columbus that I'm going to talk about. At issue, fundamentally, is the cultural encoding of space that determines who can access the spatially figured sites of safety and security that home connotes. Domus, the Latin word for the upper-class home, conveys a bounded territoriality to ideals of single-family housing prevalent in the U.S. as other countries. It embodies social and physical, virtual, but also quite material relations. Its proprietary, its propertied formulation of home colonizes the shared realms of animal, plant, and mineral, domesticated as the normative family, pet, lawn, and house. These objectified naturalizations of the domestic deny home to outsiders, identified as vagrants, pests, and vacancy, and I've been interested to hear the term vacancy used a lot today. It's one I question a good bit with my students. Such naturalizations continually displace and replace outsiders, so-called others, through spatialized processes of taking and rebuilding that commodify its privileging norms. The implicit exclusions of urban renewal redux underwrite a cycle of what I call disreplacement, continually reproducing virtual and material externality, and thereby precarity. So my overall question is, how can other uses and values of home rescript the prevailing terms and forms that domesticate externality? I mean, that is assuming optimistically that maybe they can. Anthropologist Elizabeth Povinelli writes, quote, within a neoliberal framework, any social investment that does not have a clear end and market value, as we've talked about much today, returning to the quote, fails economically and morally. But can we change that chain? Can we change that frame, or at least stretch it, literally, physically, and materially? Instead of new urbanist models of exclusion, I'm shopping for architectures that can remake disreplacement. I'm looking for the freak disreplacement figured by a model of cohabitation, shared living in, that reoccupies the virtual and material interdependencies, the insides and outsides of home. I'm after the responsiveness that posthumanist Donna Haraway conditions as respecere. Haraway draws on the Latin word meaning to look again, tied to the act of respect, with its combined meanings of consideration, perception, and looking back. Following Haraway, my modular habitat project, or I should say our modular habitat project, turns to other species and scales of home. And I'm saying our out of respect to some students and colleagues who are here today, who have worked with me on this. The first modular habitats are located in the backyard of the Godman Guild Association, a community service organization with education and gardening programs for adults, teens, and young children. This guild represents a more democratized version of the European Guild House, offering services to its immediate neighborhood and the larger city. The habitat's placement here, within the chain-linked boundary of a populous institution, along a street leading to rows of new urbanist houses, the built versions of the architectural renderings that I showed a few slides earlier, interjects other outside forms of use, value, and home. Our soft plastic forms counter the hard, flat surfaces of the earlier quoted creative class, single-family Wineland Park homes down the street. It's a relatively quiet interjection, though, I hope, sitting lightly and detachably on the ground. These photos show our modular habitat structures just after they've been initially cloaked in their new plastic skins. After this, we tailored the plastic a bit more. The aesthetic expresses a material plasticity disengaged from the redevelopment's stolid concrete foundations in the manner of post-colonial theorist Homi Bhabha's, quote, aesthetic distance, end quote. This distance, too, relies on the constraints that do define and bound it, but looks for a critical opening inside them. The habitat's design is based on the plastic hoop house. Its lightweight, tensile architecture, common in the farming and nursery industries and talked about earlier today, lends itself to the portability called for in a highly mobile neighborhood. Shown here is the conventional steel frame model, seen most frequently here at the experimental garden site of one of the project collaborators, Joe Kovach, who is with the Ohio Agricultural, recently retired from, I should say, the OARDC, Ohio Agricultural Research and Development Center located in Worcester, Ohio. Hi, Casey Hoy, who is also part of that organization, that very fine organization. Like so many industry-oriented Rust Belt developments of the mid-20th century, the neighborhood of our project lost many residents, about 2,000 in one-third of a square mile between 1970 and 2000. That's from a City of Columbus Department of Development study in 2006. The neighborhood is known in different circles for its concentrations of foreclosure, arson, industrial contamination, crime, poverty, migratory bird and human populations, human trafficking, and its location immediately southeast of The Ohio State University's main campus. The Ohio State University knows it as a place where the more than 90% of humans rent, most move frequently, half are African American, 40% are unemployed, 18% have full-time employment, and half the children live in single-parent homes. That's from a study by Forrest and Goldstein, who are researchers here at OSU. The statistics, as I was saying, come from a survey sponsored by OSU and the Columbus Foundation, a leading philanthropic organization here. These partners in the neighborhood's redevelopment, along with the City of Columbus and other nonprofit and corporate investors, call it Wineland Park. But most people living there call it the Short North, identifying with an adjacent gentrified area. The naming discrepancy points to a territorial contestation between the developers, the so-called developers, and the residents in a process of domesticating colonization. The public-private redevelopment group, the self-titled Wineland Park Collaborative, inscribes the landscape term and scenography of park on the neighborhood they're actively reforming. And Brian, most conveniently, thank you for showing us some of this pastoralized, romanticized heritages of park. The term evokes an elite history and pastoral aesthetic derived from European country estates. Its inscription on the not-so-elite neighborhood repeats an imperialist pattern of naming the colonized place along with its objectified residents, ironically, who become subjects. Baba terms this process signifying a pun in which oppressors project their fears, anxieties, and domestications upon and dominations, I should say, domestications would be my term, upon the oppressed. The university has an understandable interest in measures to protect students living in the neighborhood where violence does occur. But this is an interest shared by many others living there who don't identify with the redevelopment or its name for their home. Our redesign of the standard high tunnel hoop house into modular units adapts to different forms and densities of housing, from duplex yards to apartment balconies. This photo shows the frame of a smaller pod size completed last summer by my studio, actually in summer 2012 now, by a landscape architecture design studio I taught here, and an international workshop with students and faculty from the University of Seoul and Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok. The modular habitats shown here before we reclothed them in plastic after working more on the framing last spring, consist of the hoop house structures and raised beds, as I said earlier, for vegetables and berries. The houses are constructed with inexpensive PVC frames and a special UV filtering plastic. The resizable houses are for vegetables and berries, the insects that pollinate them and eat consuming insects, the worms that oxygenate their roots, and the soil microbes that feed them, binding their human domestic partners into relationships of cohabitation. Their productive benefits exceed their material and environmental costs by extending the growth season through passive solar energy and by averting the use of pesticides and fungicides, at least when they're standing. Typically, plastic is removed from even the conventional steel frame structures of hoop houses used in industry because the frames aren't designed to support snow load, and even if they could, the plastic covering can't. It would sag and tear between the framing members. We spaced our PVC framing closer together than the typical steel frame members and left the plastic on for snow season as an experiment. Last December, during the busy end of winter semester, and of course, our project manager's case of pneumonia, very timely, we had an intense snow. Afterward, both structures looked like the one in the foreground of this photo on the left. The PVC framing, your left, too. The PVC framing and plastic had partially collapsed under the snow load, as here. But when we could get back to the structures and clear the snow off, the PVC frames bounced right back up, largely undamaged except for a few pop joints, quickly, easily, and fairly cheaply fixed with PVC glue, and small tears in the plastic even more easily repaired with clear plastic weatherproof tape. When spring break came in March, some student volunteers and I, thank you if you're here, added additional PVC framing to reinforce one of the structures. The one closer, are you seeing? Yeah. The one closer here to Godman-Kilt's building here, main building that you see in the background, standing under the snow load there. Jane Murphy, hi Jane, thank you very much for your help. An architecture faculty member here who teaches structures courses, much to her delight, kindly visited the site with me and advised on the addition of more crawl braces to bolster the structure, both to strengthen its load-bearing capacity and to knit it together so it responds to loads as a unit. The additional reinforcement held under the next snow load, admittedly lighter than the first one, but still heavy enough to sink our other structure, our control unit, because I'm a scientist too. All right. So when we cleared the snow off that one, it too popped right back up again, undamaged, as you were seeing. These photos were taken the day students and I removed the plastic after the first snow. So even when partly collapsed, the flexible frames and plastic held the snow off the plants inside that we then harvested and took to the retail venue of our community partner, Local Matters, to sell to high-end users, people who can afford to purchase at an upscale market. The flexible structures also respond resiliently to high winds, in which the PVC frames and with them their plastic covers move with the wind. During the spring, we were designing. Strong winds ripped the plastic entirely off of Joe Kovach's unyielding conventional steel frames, shredding it in the process. He then had to go through an arduous process of repairing and remounting the plastic. After high winds, we've only had to tape up small holes in the plastic of our flexible structures, nothing more. Our raised beds are constructed with pervious and impervious barrier materials, galvanized steel mesh fencing, steel reinforcement bars, and compost-heavy soil. Rain barrels connected to the irrigation system here collect storm water for partially off-grid watering. Bamboo, also grown in the raised beds, as you can see here in the foreground, whose construction reveals that impervious, rigid plastic barrier for containment of this species, this bamboo species, which grows rhizomatically like grass. Anyway, the bamboo will more cheaply and sustainably replace the PVC framing in future modules. And my hope is maybe both here at this site and off-site elsewhere in the neighborhood. Or in the city, wherever it's wanted. The project conceives urban space as, and I'm going to quote from the geographer Karen Till here, as, quote, inhabited worlds infused with many forms of value, rather than as property or according to capitalist forms of exchange value only. That's from her article, Wounded Cities, Memory Work, and a Place-Based Ethics of Care. So I was quite interested to hear Jennifer Jordan's thinking about how our architectures can also erase memories in certain ways, something to talk with you more about. OSU's International Poverty Solutions Collaborative, which has now been disbanded, and Food Innovation Center funded the project, proposed as, quote, a demonstration pilot for urban agriculture, ecology, and entrepreneurs. Through the grant year, I collaborated with faculty in city and regional planning. Hi, Bernadette. Thank you for collaborating. And agroecology and horticulture and community partners, the Godman Guild and Local Matters, which I referenced earlier, a local food private nonprofit with a retail venue in Columbus's North Market. We've created a plan for integrating the project with other neighborhood efforts to grow food to eat or sell. We've quantified the harvest and profit yields, and honestly, those profit yields haven't been much this year. In fact, we haven't made a profit yet. And have held focus groups with neighborhood residents on their interest in and potential adaptation and use of our model structures. These things are, in part, yes, the market output valuations that Povinelli criticizes for their neoliberal framework. While agreeing with her critique, I cannot completely discount the loud call for marketable skills and jobs in the neighborhood of our project, as heard in our meetings with residents. And I actually wasn't at this meeting, but my colleague Jake Boswell, who created this very nice word cloud and is here today, did. And thank you, Jake, for this slide. So I can't ignore the mothers who fought for and got yard space for gardening outside their subsidized rental units the summer we were building. And that was partly thanks to KB Jones' intervention through her contacts in the neighborhood. Or the funders who will pay for research into architectures of inclusion under whatever capitalist name. The Wyland Park Homes developer has called urban ag the golf course of the redevelopment, unabashedly recognizing its market utility, but also supporting grassroots gardening in the neighborhood. We'll see what happens in another 20 years when some of these FHA mortgages end. This urbanized agriculture that disreplaces a suburbanized golf course still offers a functional, if also commodified, complementarity that can serve multiple interests, forms, scales, and species of home, even if not all. So I also cite the theorist Judith Butler in trying to stretch the institutional frames of power, recognition, and identity without denying our dependence on those frames. The project crosses conventions of research delimited as social science or natural physical science, as if they have to be different. It combines social, material, and ecological research into the socially, materially, and environmentally iterative processes of form making. I understand space as a conditioning of occupation by various processes that is known through bodily sensation as well as social, marketable exchange. I know home in naming it, but the space of home is also felt, smelt, tasted, heard, and seen. It is voiced physically as it is termed socially. It is formed materially as it is practiced virtually and bodily. Till argues for the tangibility that I seek to unfix portably, accessibly, and bodily within the built environment. Quoting her again, because the meanings of a city are not stable in time or space, the politics of memory also refers to the practices and motivations whereby groups attempt to fix time and identity by deploying the material and symbolic qualities of particular places and landscapes. And I saw that also in Jennifer's talk. End quote. Till differentiates from the spatial fixity of neoliberalism the, quote, intimate relationships, end quote, that attach to affective networks and lend, quote, thick meaning to an inhabitant's experience of place in the city, end quote. Architectures of home temporally occupy material conditions along with social ones. Their embodied forms enclose and codify and represent other bodies, as bodies live in and commodify and represent them in time and space. Bodies, as Butler points out, are constituted socially and physically. Like her, and I'm quoting her, I'm interested in the modalities of performativity that take it out of its purely textual context, end quote. Modular habitat demonstrates that architectures of home perform as figures that encase other figures, like shape-shifting Russian dolls in relational landscapes. Willingly or not, the performance engages multiple interdependent scales and species of actors. As Baba shows, quote, the intimate recesses of the domestic space become sites for history's most intricate invasions. And I'd like to show one of those invasions. Now, please look on kind of this part of the screen for some other residents of our property that I was able to video and then insert it as a video, I'm very proud, into this PDF. So I hope you saw this, because I can't replay it, right? All right. Oh, I do have to. You said if I click off, I can go forward. There. The project's do-it-yourself, DIY, methodology, and aesthetic efface the co-researchers, students, and me as project architects. Our anonymity ties to a goal of physically crossing the Guild's fence boundary into the home and yard spaces of the surrounding neighborhood, and maybe beyond on the other side of that chain link fence through implementation of our demonstrated affordable and rescalable DIY modules. Does its object of diffusing freak disreplacements amount to a disingenuous desituation of our authorship? On this question, I refer to another geographer, Natalie Oswin's argument, quote, that the advancement of a critical queer approach to developmental time is necessary to begin to undermine an illiberal politics of pragmatism in this so-called global creative city, end quote. With her, I'm in the market for materialities as well as virtualities, marking multiply embodied and identified sensuous intersectionalities. That's her quoting Munoz. Many others live in and enact such forms in terms of home. As a landscape architect, I deal in these most physical of intersections to counter dead-ended, universalizing claims of abstracted boundaries. The students and I have created documentation of the project's inhabitants, materials, processes, and assembly for dissemination through training workshops, the Guild's adult and child education programs, and online. Is this a one-way paternalistic exchange? So far, kind of. Though we have collaborators, certainly outside the university, and our modular, mutable designs encourage adoptive redesign that I anticipate learning from in turn. My adherence to this and other landscape architecture projects depends on its proliferative rescripting, its redesign by others of various species. And still, the project carries an aesthetic. I would just want to catch up with myself. These are some of our sort of design renderings that are put into a sort of a booklet documenting the project that I'll show you later. So I hope our project carries an aesthetic that counters that of the comfortably priced Wineland Park homes down the street, which are not so comfortably priced by many people now living in that neighborhood. Is it important to me that the PVC frames are lavender and the plastic is a translucent, not transparent, milky white that's now a lot dirtier, as some of y'all saw yesterday? Yes. But I also hope that this aesthetic can adapt, squeeze, and shape-shift into the yards, front porches, and creative taste of the neighborhood's residents. By designing for mutability and mobility, which are parameters of the project's modularity, I ask myself a lot if we unwittingly reinforce a message of disreplacement, or can new forms of architecture stake claim to real estate in the city without domestication by the urban redevelopment market? How can access to the material means of architectural and agricultural production secure a living space for outsiders inside the capitalized power regime bounding home? I don't have these answers yet, and I don't aspire to complete resolutions. My ending questions guide this and potential future projects toward which we're collecting our liberalized seed data. I'm actually the person who picked Julie up the other day from the airport and talked about the inherent optimism of design and landscape architecture and architecture. And, you know, I was thinking also as she was talking about that and how it worried her, how I could read one of those ending questions or any of these questions in a very optimistic tone of voice, as in, how can access to the material means of architectural and agricultural production secure a living space for outsiders inside the capitalized power regime bounding home? Or I could read it really pessimistically and skeptically and critically. How can access to the material means of architectural and agricultural production secure a living space for outsiders inside the capitalized power regime bounding home? You know, I could read this same question either way, and I guess maybe that's an ending point, as we can ask these questions, and I think we can ask them under various guises, under various frames, but I think the important thing is that we are asking them. So I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you, Katherine. Next, I'm delighted that we have Dr. Teresa Long here, and she is a real proper doctor, like me, so if anyone is going to keel over, she's the one to go to. So she is the Columbus Health Commissioner, and she's been the Health Commissioner since 2002. And her, prior to her appointment as the Health Commissioner, she has been with the Public Health Department for 15 years, serving as the Medical Director and Assistant Health Commissioner. And then prior to her time here in Columbus, Dr. Long served on the front lines of the emerging AIDS epidemic in San Francisco, and she has been also committed to looking, giving her attention to overcoming that disease here in Columbus too. We are delighted that Dr. Long is also a clinical associate professor here at Ohio State at the College of Public Health, and she has won many awards for her work to eliminate racism and empower women, which are always fantastic things. So we're delighted to have Dr. Long here. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yes. How about way in the yes, you can. In fact, how about this? Just stand up. Come on. You all need a stretch. It's like a 7-minute stretch. Just for a sec. You can do it. I know you can. I should ask you to applause. I guess you did. That's great. Thank you again. Actually, thanks, Bernadette, for your ongoing partnership, frankly, with Columbus Public Health, and for inviting me to be part of this panel. And actually, I have been here a very long time. Adding that all up, I've been here over 27 and a half years. I was chatting with Julia about my daughter wants to go to California to school. And I think it still feels like home, but nonetheless, this is my home, and our home, at least for the moment. So again, it's a pleasure to be here with you all, and Katherine and Brian, thanks for letting me be a part of your panel on this important topic. Yeah, there's a lot to talk about. This is a very varied group. Obviously, the presentations I came last night and today, so I felt like I needed to learn something. I have learned a lot, but I've also learned from a lot of different kinds of people in the audience. So again, I'm excited. I'm encouraged by what I've heard so far today. I hope you are as well, because whether it's the God McGill tube houses, what's going on in New York City, certainly what's going on, there are lots of efforts that I think that we all either are beginning or need to continue to explore that will build upon this whole notion of urban agriculture and how it can positively impact both the landscape and obviously, from my perspective, the people who call that landscape home. So indeed, over the last few days, you've again heard from a lot of really smart people who've shared, I think, some pretty innovative ideas or reflections on how we can improve food security, food production, access and equity. And actually, Jason works with us. Jason reads from the Kerr Institute on lots of things. So there's a lot of equity and social justice and fairness built into our programming. But it's certainly my hope that those of you who are here both have been enlightened but are also challenged to think about ways that you can continue, if you haven't, or if you'll begin if you haven't, to influence the positive trends in this urban revitalization to improve food systems in our own community. So food access and food security clearly is important to all of us because really we're all directly impacted, as are all of our members in our greater community. So again, as you've learned, or you already knew your time here, that there are many social and cultural, clearly economic, health and wellness issues that are all a part of this. So let me start and see if, what does it here? There we go. Oh. So again, that's, I think, actually I've been asking a couple of people, so why am I here today? So I'm your health commissioner, especially if you live in Columbus, but even if you don't, you're here now. So I'm responsible for your health and well-being and at least your health protection together with you. And yes, Columbus is the 15th largest city. We heard about Detroit today. We're bigger than Detroit. We heard about Boston, and we're bigger than Boston. And yes, you can take Cleveland and Cincinnati, put them together, and we're still bigger. Which is of course shocking to many, but that is indeed the case. And yes, food systems are important from a public health system. So I'm here again to, I think it boils down to you, to me, and really to our own health, and actually to the health, of course, and the well-being of all of our neighbors and all of our residents. Really, that's why I'm here, and I hope ultimately, I think all of us are here about health and well-being of all of our communities. I'm also not here to give an academic talk, so different than others. I think I'm here to give a practical perspective about what's going on here in Columbus, but I also think what could be going on in many communities across our country. So with that, food is universal. And in fact, it's a fundamental, of course, resource for life. We have to have it. We talked a little bit about water. We need that too. We need a few more things, but we have to eat to be able to continue our life. But it's really much more than that. And frankly, it's a universal connector. I was intrigued by Jennifer Jordan's talk about memory and our identity connected to food. Frankly, it is a universal connector of people and of cultures, even when we don't even speak the same language. And as I was listening this morning, you may know that we do have a lot in our public health business, a lot of connection to food. Mostly it's around all of our food service operations. There are 6,000 restaurants, more coming online every day. But indeed, one of the newest businesses for new immigrants is to start, it makes sense, it's cultural, is to start a food operation. So we indeed find lots of interesting issues, and we try and educate all 6,000 licensees, and then we have enforcement powers. So I'll tell you, there's some really fascinating things when you tie food to all of that. We all have different views of what's safe or not safe, but indeed there are some rules that we have to follow. But again, food is really more than that. Yes, there's food safety, but really, food, again, connects us across traditions and celebrations in our households, with others around the world. It brings people together. I think we've talked some about that. It really highlights some of the best of what a city has to offer, and we have some fabulous food. My hometown, San Francisco, has fabulous food. New York City has fabulous food, but right here in Columbus. And actually, I think really that is one of the things that so many cities now can be proud of. It's where us as Americans share some of our best, coming from our homelands, wherever that might be. And really the other is, and it is an opportunity to start a new business. And as I said, so food brings us together. It's also something that, again, from my perspective, it's also about what we consume, how we consume it, how much we consume. That also affects us all. And so irregardless of who we are and where we come from, food is, of course, universal and essential to health. So let me say something about nutrition. This is, I'm called Debbie Downer because I come with bad news sometimes. And so here's the bad news, that yes, indeed, poor nutrition can equal poor health outcomes. And I'm going to speak mostly about diabetes. But at its core, there really is a general link between poor nutrition and negative health outcomes. Child growth and development, our overweight and obesity, and actually that is a global pandemic, and we can talk about that if you want. But clearly diabetes and some cancers are all directly related to poor nutrition. And so healthy nutrition is really important, and it's more than ever, obviously, as our nation faces this growing obesity epidemic. You've heard some people allude to that. It really does threaten a whole new generation of our young people. And I was actually chatting with Julia about our daughters. So let me just speak about this, and then I'll get to my daughter. But during the 2009-2010 school year here in Columbus, 29% of our kindergartners are already overweight. 39% of our third graders are overweight, and 47%, so 50% of our fifth graders are already overweight. So of course, well, if you don't know, that clearly puts them at great risk for all of these chronic diseases, but diabetes is a great one to focus on. And I will come back to that. But again, that's the magnitude of the problem. So our youngest residents really now face health issues that were once really thought of only to be adult problems. Type 2 diabetes in young children, it's amazing what we're seeing now as health professionals. And for the first time, our children, and I talk a lot about my daughter, because she's still a child, she's 17, but she's a blind for dollar now. But nonetheless, my daughter, and if you have children or you know young people, and actually maybe some of you, but the life expectancy of our young people is now, for the first time in world history, predicted to be shorter than that of their parents. Never happened before, and that's because of this epidemic of chronic disease that is, of course, sweeping our world. So clearly there is reason for us all to be concerned and to be active. So again, it's not just kids whose waistlines are increasing either. Honestly, here in Columbus, already 60% of us adults are overweight, and frankly, one-third of our adults are obese. That's big. That is a big problem for all of us. So again, we really do need to keep active and keep thinking about healthy nutrition. And in fact, just the magnitude, and we've been talking about already had lots of diabetes. We had 90,000 people living with diabetes, making that nearly 10% of our adult population already diagnosed with diabetes. So let me speak also about some of the issues around justice, fairness, or at least in this case, health disparities, where some of the health equity work comes in. Nearly twice the number of Black Franklin County adults have been diagnosed with diabetes compared with our white residents. In 2010, 200 people, doesn't sound like a lot maybe, but it is, died from diabetes in Franklin County. It actually made it the 6th leading cause of death in Franklin County. But the risk of death is twice as high for people who have diabetes versus someone with the same age who didn't have diabetes. Again, so it magnifies your risk for death. And then if you're Black, if you're African American, your odds of dying from diabetes were even worse. Here right in Franklin County, you're 2.6 times more likely to die from diabetes than your white counterparts. So numbers like that are challenging, and clearly diabetes itself is challenging. The everyday life of people, of our family members, our friends, our neighbors, and our colleagues who have it are challenged because clearly stroke and heart attack and kidney failure, amputation, dialysis, the result of that kidney failure, and then early onset diabetes are all very real and becoming more real at an earlier age. So indeed, despite the science that shows, of course, that good nutrition can help maintain a healthy weight, prevent many of these chronic diseases, we still have issues around access to healthy, fresh foods, and that remains a challenge right here in our community for far too many people. We actually, well, I won't talk about that. So, access to healthy foods and food access. So, there are national organizations like the Food Trust and the Policy Link, and we've talked about how few there are that think about policy, but clearly there are issues around health policy and accessing health food that are challenges here for many Americans. And frankly, those living in low-income neighborhoods and communities of color and rural areas actually have that magnified. The research shows that the lack of access to healthy foods in low-income census tracts, let me say this correctly, that low-income census tracts have half as many supermarkets as wealthy census tracts, and that only 8% of African Americans in the country live in a tract that has a supermarket versus 31% of the majority white population. That's pretty dramatic. Communities without a supermarket have higher rates of diabetes. We've been able to map that across the country, and they also have higher disease-related death rates. The low-income zip codes across the country also have 30% more convenience stores, which of course tend to lack fresh food and healthy food items, and that's compared just to middle-income zip codes. So clearly these issues of equity and fairness jump right out of us. Additionally, residents in urban transportation areas have limited transportation options sometimes to reach supermarkets, further limiting their access. So I think many who've used public transportation, I grew up with public transportation, and we figured out a way. But nonetheless, I think that adds to the challenge. So eating away from home, the fast food availability, the living in a neighborhood with fewer supermarkets and more convenience stores, all of these actually can be mapped against less healthy diets and higher rates of obesity and early mortality. So again, these are national statistics, but they clearly mirror some of our local issues right here in Franklin County. So I heard someone say earlier that food maps are boring. I'm sorry. Sort of, not really. Because I think it is a way of us, and we don't talk about food deserts. Someone said something about that. This is really about food imbalance. And this is how we have chosen to map this here in Franklin County. So in 2011, we produced a food map to illustrate the areas where the city where it's more difficult to buy fresh and nutritious foods compared to that of food of higher quality. And then we have just updated that in 2013. We know that these areas are important because people generally live and use the types of food sources that are closest to them. So living in an area where it's hard to buy healthy and nutritious foods really does put you, of course, at greater risk than those who live closer to a full-service grocery store or healthier options. The food map does look at these grocery stores and the locations of fast food restaurants. That's what we used as a comparison. The analysis then looked at the distance from each census block to the nearest full-service grocery and the nearest fast food restaurants, and then we express those as a ratio. And so the ratio 1-to-1 meant that it was equal distance to a full-service grocery store or a fast food restaurant. So you can see that in the yellow, that ratio is less than 1-to-1. A full-service grocery store is close to you versus, of course, where it's not so close to you. So again, yellow, it doesn't look so yellow, I'm so sorry. So call it the lightest color you see. The lightest color you see, of course, has the greatest access to grocery stores. The next, that goldenrod color actually is where, and it may not be so bad, but it's not so good either, that the distance or the ratio, you would have to travel 1 to 2.5 times further to get to a grocery store than you would to fast food outlets. And then finally in the red is where you would have to travel 2.5 times as far to get to any fresh food outlet than you would to a fast food outlet. So again, you can see some of the difference. I would note that on average for all census tracts in Columbus, people have to travel twice as far to get to a grocery store than they do to a fast food restaurant. So that's not so great. But nonetheless, when we look at the red area, those are the people who live in these areas that are most challenged. The good news is we've done some mapping again, and you can see that the blue circles, and those I just wanted to point out where there were a lot of concentration of red, and the blue circles from 2011 to 2013, there actually has been improvement as far as being able to bring in fresh food options to some of these areas, or to see that some of the fast food outlets went away. So again, that's why it's important. We really do care, because food is a place-based asset, place-based, and clearly the geographic area where people live there are likely to look for food sources close to them, and we'd like them to look for food sources closer to them. So again, we can better target, and that's why we care about it. We work with many partners and share this information. You may be interested, many are interested in this, so they can also help to better focus their efforts to look at the issues around the food system. Again, I wanted to note that we're working with a lot of partners, the Food Innovation Center, one of them, actually with Colleen Spees, and I think Colleen may still be here. And actually, I think Bernadette, you're working with us on this as well. We're about to go out and survey 1,400 residents in some of our lower income or inner city, actually no, it's good, inner city neighborhoods, Franklinton, downtown, and near North Side, portions of the South Side, again, to get a better picture of people's experience, really, in trying to get to foods and to better supplement these maps that are, fairly high level and fairly arbitrary. So again, we really are looking forward to some of that more specific and specific information. So in public health, again, we've noticed and known for a long time that the impact of a poor diet and lack of food access does impact health. And again, historically, we have really focused our efforts on educating and trying to change personal behavior. So yes, education is good. Changing personal behavior is really hard. But nonetheless, I did want to mention at least some of the ways we've tried to change the options. One of them is an example of a long-standing program that we have run, an evidence-based program called Healthy Children, Healthy Weights. It's designed to prevent overweight, childhood overweight, and obesity by providing healthy weight and growth to all children, starting at the youngest age group, starting at 0, going to 5 years old. We partner with early learning centers, including childcare and preschool centers, to provide practical strategies to establish both environments and policies. We definitely try and work on the policies in those organizations to promote healthy weight in children. The program really is a great resource. The parents are brought in, and we work with the parents as well and others who provide care to the young children. The science tells us that if we don't start early, that we will not have a good chance to try and modify this, that starting before the age of 5, and I was never taught in medical school, along with many other physicians, that actually most of our eating habits are set by the time we're 5. So indeed, we really do want to work at this earliest age group, and then of course support parents and caregivers in understanding this as well. So yes, it's about the education, it's about the experiences that the young children have, it's about what their providers are, and it's about changing that environment, changing the policies and the environment and the milieu, so they have the opportunity to grow into a healthy and fit life. There is evidence, and we've been able to look at this, that in fact, we are changing some of this. And in fact, we're starting to see a bending excited, but a bending of the curve of some of these obesity and overweight numbers in our Columbus City schools. So hang tight, I hope, but we need to continue this. So in public health, we do recognize that, in fact, it's community-level policies and systems and environments that really, I think, will actually make it easier for our residents to improve their diets and, of course, to improve their health. So, again, we really do try and think about population-based approaches. We work with, again, local food systems and the public health interventions to improve the health access, of course, to try and improve healthy food preparation, food justice, health equity. We've talked about that a little bit. Again, using all of the population-based approaches to try and change the policies, the systems, and the environments in which people live and work and play. So again, Columbus Public Health, we're happy to be in partnerships with some of you. Actually wanted to bring it up here. The whole list of sponsors and collaborators reads like a partner list for us. I'm proud of that, but include the Mid-Ohio Food Bank and Matt Habash, Local Matters, the university, the Kerwin Institute, the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission, the Miracle Grow. In fact, we work a lot with residents and resident organizations as well. So you've heard some great examples of some of that work already. But let me just speak a little bit about some of our work and the work that we share on population-based approaches. So together with partners, we've all been talking about community gardens. And in fact, we at Columbus Public Health have sponsored and supported 100 community gardens in low-income areas where there are obviously these disproportionate health issues. We also, in Columbus, are home to 250 community gardens and growing. Not as many as in New York City, but we hope to get to 500. Of course, to both increase food production in needy areas, but clearly some of the produce in these community gardens are being also donated to food pantries, to residents in the areas as well. Actually, we're proud. We had 8 community gardens that we've worked very hard with. We've worked with them to help establish them, to come up with themes for those community gardens. We have walking maps that we walk with the residents to create the walking maps for their gardens. They actually have art pieces in their gardens, and they are linked to other community issues like violence prevention of youth, or of course having a youth-led garden as well. So we're very proud of that. Those 8 gardens actually contributed also 5,000 pounds this past summer to food pantries in their low-income neighborhoods. So again, it's connecting a lot of dots. And as we continue, we think, to try and address food access and increase food production in these underserved neighborhoods, we also are trying to provide technical assistance to the food pantries and to other organizations to, again, help them in being able to work with their food pantry recipients, food recipients, to understand how to best cook with these foods. And then, of course, you know lots about gardens, so I'm not going to go on about them, but they are all about food security, food production, access, etc. But they also are about neighborhood safety. I haven't heard that mentioned today. Actually, one of the biggest reasons the Prevention Institute out of Oakland, California, looking at national data, said the number one reason that people won't go back out of the house at night to try and get food from a location, any location, is because they're afraid of their personal safety. So it actually took me a long time, but when I heard that aha, it's very interesting to think about the link between personal safety and food access. But indeed, it is there. And of course, it's community building. We love that. And it is about physical activity. So people do break a sweat when they're in their gardens, especially when it's hot in the summer. So with that, let me also share about farmers markets. And if you haven't been to our place, this is our place. This is our farmers market. We have worked very hard on trying to bring fresh fruits and vegetables to underserved parts of our community. For 10 years now, we have hosted 3 signature farmers markets on our grounds every summer at Parsons Avenue. We're right in the Near East Side, a very low-income area that has challenges around food access. And yes, indeed, our farmers bring in fresh and nutritious vegetables. We serve about 10,000 every year. A lot of them are our women, infant and children, are with moms, but not all. Many of them are our residents in our neighborhood. But I just wanted to comment, someone mentioned about the SNAP or the food stamp benefits and how, I think it was a Michigan speaker, we're very excited and proud of that as well. So there really are win-wins, and clearly farmers markets, community gardens also offer challenges because of some of their periodicity, because we really can't run them year-round. I would also just stop here at this farmers market because there was a really interesting talk, and I think it was early this morning when someone was talking about Torino, Italy, when they repurposed their farmer or their community market to sell soft goods on Sundays. That was really great. But let me just share a story with you about how we, for a while, repurposed our farmers market. So we thought, great, 10,000 people, this is amazing. So let's bring in health information and partners, etc. And we shut down the freeways. There were so many people that wanted to come and they wouldn't leave because they were getting so much good information that, in fact, the police came to us and said that we had shut down I-70 and 71, people trying to get off at the exits, that they were going to close us down and clear everybody off the property. I'm like, okay, just stop. So suffice it to say, you need to think about all of the infrastructure issues if you start to think about either repurposing or going beyond. So again, you guys can think about that. I was thrilled. You know, the helicopters were flying overhead taking pictures of people stopping the freeway with fresh fruits and vegetables. So I thought it was a win, but nonetheless, we had to say goodbye to the other officers. We're sticking just with fruits and vegetables. So again, repurposing, or at least thinking about the venue and how it can do that. On to the built environment, and many of you are way more expert than I in the built environment, but this has been a personal passion of mine because how we build and design our communities really does matter, and it matters to health, and it matters around food issues. So in public health, we have been working in lots of different ways on place in the built environment, but clearly we have been working with developers and with the city about assuring that there are safe and appropriate lighting, sidewalks, bike paths, facilities where residents can walk. And some of you may know, since 2005, we've actually employed a city planner on our public health staff to help us be a boundary spanner in doing that work, because frankly, there are different languages that we speak. And again, I won't speak too long about safe trails and sidewalks. I'm glad I don't have too many pictures about biking after what we heard today about the aspects of bike lanes and what it means to see those coming in your neighborhood. But clearly we are influencing policies and trying to close gaps to develop walkable communities, bikeable communities, where you again can take your dog for a walk, where you could walk to a neighborhood park, where you could walk to your school library, and in some neighborhoods you know that's a challenge, or even better, where you could walk to a supermarket to buy fresh food. And so on that issue of walkability, again, we try very hard to see that residents have greater access to fresh foods, whether that be right at a grocery store or at convenience stores. And we've got a partnership I know some of you are aware of with United Way to put fresh food in 3 corner stores, at least in Franklinton, again, an area with no grocery store. And that has actually been a very successful partnership. We're trying to figure out how to grow that as well. Then let me speak a little bit about access to supermarkets and what that means. So in fact, people who live in neighborhoods with at least one supermarket consume 32% more fruits and vegetables than those who live in neighborhoods without a supermarket. That's amazing. So 32% more fruits and vegetables right there. So for every additional supermarket that is in a neighborhood, you can actually increase it. And in fact, for those who are white, you increase their fresh food consumption of fresh fruits and vegetables by 11%. And for African Americans, it's 32%. So again, these are pretty big numbers that could have a big health impact. Again, supermarkets close to children's homes, those are also associated with, we can do the mapping across the country with lower rates of being overweight. Supermarkets also increase, as you likely know, housing values in surrounding neighborhoods because they're really an anchor for economic development as well, and for other retailers. For example, a couple years ago, actually, our development department used tax incentives to bring Save-A-Lot, a grocery store, to the Near East Side. And in fact, it has done a lot to help people get some access to fresh fruits and vegetables. And we had a partnership with the OSU here to teach how to folks who were using that grocery store, to teach them how to use the fresh fruits and vegetables that were available there. So we know it works, but we also know that there's lots more to do. There was one thing I was going to mention, and I guess I could who are architects. I don't get a chance to build a building very often, but every once in a while I do, or to influence that. And so we've actually had two just come online recently. One was actually a partnership. It was an expansion of a church-based location that's really a community center on the south side called Community Development for All People. They have and wanted to put in a commercial kitchen to be able to better serve and work with people who are at their food pantry. And so we helped build and design and fund a large kitchen there. And even better, we actually just opened, though it's not open for primary care, it's open for our WIC clinic, a new building on the south side, a little further south, that's LEED certified. You can be proud of that. But indeed, it will have primary care starting on Monday. It will have OSU specialty health services in this. It already has our WIC program, and it will have mental health services. And then it has a beautiful community kitchen. And it will be home to the Moms to Be partnership led by OSU, working with pregnant women, but it's available 6 more days a week. So I don't know who's got great ideas. I was talking to the Ross Hart Hospital people last week. They were excited. But if people have ideas about how to use a beautiful community space linked to a community kitchen, we'd be thrilled to talk about that. So again, that really is what I want to start to close with and think about some aha, or at least one aha that I've had as health commissioner. And it really had to do with this active and vibrant community. Several years ago, our mayor, Mike Holland, our mayor Mike, shown here as Bike and Mike, and he held a citizen sign trying to, again, help chart the course for the future of Columbus. It was around our bicentennial, which was last year. So we had over 1,000 people who were there at the convention center. And while we were all there, he asked a question, which was, what kind of city do you want to live in? And the response was amazing. It was really overwhelming. People said, and we were using all kinds of different ways to get at it, that the number one by far and away choice was we want to live in an active and vibrant community. And that was really an aha for me, because I knew I was in the right place. Because I knew that this city, and knowing that people cared about that, but that an active city is really a city that is not just about yourself, it's about everyone in the community, and it's about being physically active, active in the arts, active in so many ways, but it's also about being an engaged community. And that is, again, a healthy community. So thinking about vision and thinking about language, they all really matter. So again, I think we live in a city where we really would like to see and are seeing our parks and our neighborhood parks that are places where our families can play and exercise. Again, bikeable roads where, again, we have complete streets that are safe, or bike paths where for walking and biking that are safe, and that are co-created with our residents. And that we have active kids who are, again, eating healthy. They have those healthy eating habits, and they got them when they were young in order to make a difference in their lives. And a place where, again, food, and I had this slide as far as food being fuel for play, but really, food is also fuel for economic development, where we can, again, close the gaps, where, again, most of our urban landscape may serve, or could serve, or much of it could serve as a place where we could increase food accessibility and food availability. So yes, we need our food to be fuel for play, but also fuel for our economic vibrancy and sustainability. Public transportation, we need it. I show a bus, I used to show a streetcar, and I don't know what to say. Some of you can help us get there, I hope. I show it with a bike rack on the front. Now, after some work of some of your team, I know I should now have it with a food box on the front. I love that. I just learned about that when I saw it shown in the gallery. How cool. So again, where public transportation obviously can increase, and we know, and you may not know this, that people use public transportation walk 19 more minutes a day. That's fabulous for our physical activity and our wellness as well. So again, it's really this kind of city that we all want, and I think we want to work for it. We want to really help strengthen that, because I think it's through that kind of both collective vision that we are going to achieve that active and vibrant and healthy city. And again, food systems, I think, are a very important part of that. So I do want to share with you just a thought that all of this work that I've been speaking about from my perspective, and I think from some of yours, none of it is a solo act. I put public health in the center because it's my world. I was thinking about putting the food system in the front, but then some of that wouldn't make total sense. But indeed, it is about how we work together. We actually have create friends wherever we go. But again, public health, and I think actually food is not a solo act. All that we're talking about here is really a team sport. So again, I welcome your working with us. Hopefully you're interested in health and the health of your community. And again, I do want to take it back to it's about your health and it's about my health. But it's really also about the health and the well-being of all of our residents in our community. So now really is the time to address those issues around transportation and around access, around production. We've talked about that, and around equity and fairness. It really is about our young people who are at risk for food insecurity and obesity, diabetes, poor health outcomes. That's really, that it really can be. That the fact that you're here, I think really, and here together, and here at this late moment, really does inspire me and makes me think that we really can achieve that healthy and fit community for our youngest residents and for all of us. So again, I think there really is great momentum. We are all about protecting health and improving lives. I think you too are about that. Again, Bernadette's city and regional planning class just finished. Actually, it's very exciting. A studio project that I think that really linked some of this work. Her students were talking about how do we increase access through improvements to the public transportation system, to the neighborhood shopping conditions, and zoning and economic incentives and policies for doing that. So again, there is momentum. There's really excitement. And again, I'm inspired. I hope you are inspired. But I really hope you stay involved and stay committed, stay working hard, because it is hard work. And you know that we here at Columbus Public Health are really committed to working with you, to all of our partners. But again, it really is going to take all of us. So thanks again for inviting me to join. There you go. Thank you.
Kind of running out of time here, but I know you guys are all hungry. So, I'm going to take over a little bit for a few minutes, but I'd like to just sort of thank our speakers and sort of quite different types of presentations to some extent, but very much looking at kind of a community-based approaches to some of this issue around food. And I think some of what Katherine and Brian are talking about is really some of this tension, I suppose, between how we do food production and yet sort of and deal with this issue of redevelopment, or a concern about how that's changing a community and how the community may be quite different as a result of that form of redevelopment as far as urban agriculture. And in some ways, I think it speaks to a tension between what you might call the kind of use value of our land and the exchange value of it. So what we want to use the land for versus whether or not we're going to make a profit from it is sort of like a tension, in a sense, between that kind of issue. I have a couple of questions that I want to open up, and then maybe can open it up further to the audience. One was, first of all, I think Dr. Long I had a question for about if you were to balance between this issue of behavior versus kind of access, which you think might be more important. Is it that people don't have the access to the food, or that they're not aware of what it is that they should eat? If there's one over the other in terms of importance, and I think that from a kind of planning perspective, we're kind of maybe able to deal with the food access side of it. This came up in the studio a lot because some of the students felt that even if they had access, people wouldn't buy the right foods. And so just kind of getting a perspective on that. And then for Katherine's, I had a question that was related to what the reaction by the community might be to some of these the modular habitats that you're talking about. And I know you're interested in making those very mobile kind of systems, and if you feel that the community's interested in kind of using the hoop house within their own kind of gardens or in their own kind of spaces. So that was one. question. And then I think for Brian, it's not so much a question as a comment around this notion of land and power that I think Jason had brought up earlier. New York City is quite different issue there to Detroit in terms of this idea of land value and how that plays a role in the types of gardening that's going on is kind of interesting. And that tension between the traditional kind of community gardening and then this rooftop gardening is quite an interesting kind of perspective. And so I'd like to get your thoughts about that a little bit. So who would like to start? Teresa?
I'll start simply because you asked me first. So I think the question is about access, and will access to fresh foods solve the obesity epidemic? Or is it about behavior? And
which one's more important than the
or
other?
which one's more important? Well, that would really be hard because you can't act, you can't change your behavior if you don't have the opportunity. So, and we spend a lot of time, I mean, that's really a fundamental issue around fairness and around opportunity. If you can't choose to be healthy, and I don't care whatever we're talking about, you cannot choose to be healthy if you don't have the opportunity to make a choice. And you don't have an opportunity that is a healthy choice. So you can't choose to eat healthy if it's not available to you. So again, it's really multifactorial, clearly. So having access to fresh food is fundamental before you can even talk about the behavioral aspects of then being able to change that behavior. The behavior is critical, though we know, and I'm looking around, I mean, it's really hard to change our behavior. Actually, Matt Habash, who, and I think many of you may know Diane, but Matt spoke this morning, he's a binge dieter. He was just telling me, it's crazy, man. Colleen's going, yeah, crazy. And he has access to every kind of knowledge and awareness and you name it. But ultimately, changing our personal behavior, who was it? Miranda Lambert. I was just reading, my daughter's a country music fan. Can you believe that? Anyway, Miranda Lambert just lost all this weight to put on a beautiful dress. And what did she stop doing? She stopped eating her favorite food, Cheetos. Really? I mean, really. I mean, she has access to everything you can imagine. So, it's not just about knowledge. It's not just about any of that. It really, I think fundamentally, that we need to have the opportunity. So we need to have fresh foods. We need to have information and education, but it's not about that. Ultimately, if we can change the environments, we can change policies to make those healthier choices, those healthier cooking, all of it, we can make it the easy choice. Because as soon as it becomes the easy choice, we are all opportunists. So if I have carrots in the fridge and they're ready for me to grab, I'll go there. But otherwise, you know, I'm just as bad as anybody else. I'll go to the cupboard and there's lots of other things I could choose. So again, I would say it's very hard to say one over the other. They're all important, but the more we can change the environment through policy, through systems change that environment to make the healthier choice, first make the opportunity available and make the choice be easy to be healthy, we will go a long way.
Sure. Thank you for the question, Bernadette. I mentioned that we held focus groups twice toward the end of the project, toward the end of the grant year last spring, and of course you were very involved in said focus groups. Thank you again. One of the things that we heard back, and I want to say that I appreciate the question also because it gives me the chance to emphasize how important it was to work within the confines of an institution as opposed to going out into the neighborhood and willy-nilly taking over even vacant lots that were offered to me. Because I didn't want to, not as someone who is not a resident of that neighborhood, to come in and say, well, this is how you should do it. And, you know, so one of the reasons that I chose the Government Guild as a partner, or asked them to partner with me on this, was because of their role already with gardening programs in the neighborhood, and also Local Matters, the nonprofit that's working with us, but nevertheless has a for-profit retail venue, one of these boutique-y, sexy places that have been talked about. is because they also already had gardening programs going on in the neighborhood with people who expressed interest in that. So I didn't want to go in and like proselytize and say, oh, you should really be gardening, if people weren't interested in it. And so the focus groups that we held were within the structure of a workshop series that was being offered by Local Matters and the Gardening Guild. And they were directed to people who are already gardening in their own yards, as has been shown earlier today. Karen's work in Canada, especially notable for that. So, yeah, people who were interested, they did display skepticism about the idea of selling for profit. And that was always something that we wondered about and questioned ourselves. And as I mentioned, we certainly didn't make a profit this year when we were figuring things out. Can over time there be a profit? Can we start to produce on a scale? Again, there's that word, the scale that is required for this kind of market valuation. I don't know. Maybe through some of the sharing processes that have been mentioning and partnering in the ways that were suggested with some of these people who are already going in their yards. But mostly people talked about, and maybe you'll be happy to hear, about sort of using the food for themselves and with their neighbors and sharing it with their neighbors. And so that made me really question, okay, how are we valuing this project? How are we valuing this architecture? And maybe there's some other ways to value it.
So, Bernadette, I guess I'll use your comment just as an opportunity to add a few more reflections on what I spoke about. And I guess, again, I would say, I'm not really here as a critic of food systems. That's the job of many other people here in the audience. But actually, as an architect, here to learn from you. One thing I realized early on when I started researching urban agriculture and its influence on the design of cities was that first thing I needed to do was educate myself on what it means to be a farmer, what it means to grow food, and all the systems associated with that, so that I could make intelligent decisions about what seemed like good or bad design decisions. And that's just something that here at Columbus, when I went to a studio where we were designing kinds of spaces for urban agriculture that could potentially exist, it was always about learning from broad-in farmers and any number of people. We had to educate ourselves first. And I think what I see my primary role is, I don't think there's a lot of need for architects to design spaces for food. But I see my role as primarily being criticism of architectural designs for creating spaces for food or strategies for urban design. And so I think that's an important aspect of this, because there's a lot of good intentions and a lot of bad ideas through misinformation or lack of critical analysis. And so for me, looking at the kinds of farming practices that we're seeing in the city was important, because there's a tendency in popular circles and in design circles as well to kind of, it's easy to see urban agriculture as this kind of wrong thing, people farming. It's all good. Like, any kind of farming is great, it's fun. And certainly, farms like Hanlon Greens, the greenhouse farms, make great press, and they're cool, right? But to really understand what's going on here and how that might change the accessibility or the priorities around potential space within the city, in this case rooftops, I think is extremely important. I should mention that there's no, unlike the soil-based rooftop farms where we arrange the others, where they have community access and events and programming, Gotham Greens, the greenhouse farms are not accessible. So this is a space that could very easily be capitalized. And I've been surprised at how quickly it's happening and how many of these farms are spreading. And I think, to your point, it's really the intensity of land use and the relationship to power and money in New York that's responsible for creating innovations like this. And it's the presence of a population base that's affluent enough and interested in purchasing expensive produce that they can feel good about having bought from down the street or just above them. And it's not really my job to determine whether or not that actually makes good sense in terms of sustainable practices, but my job to evaluate, does it make good sense in terms of our access to the cityscapes, to the landscapes, and whether or not it would create spaces for cultural exchange, dialogue about health, about ecology, whatever it might be, which I think is what these spaces on the roof that are accessible are good at.
I just wanted to follow up on your comment. Thank you for your presentations, by the way. I'm particularly interested in the intersection between urban garden, urban farming movement, and ecosystem connections. So one of the things that you said in particular in your presentation was pointing out that the rooftop gardens in New York City are essentially qualifying for a particular stream of funding as it relates to stormwater abatement.
Yes.
So being mindful of what those decision overlaps are, I think is really exciting, because that's a whole other world of evaluation that the Environmental Protection Agency and the Clean Water Act is forcing cities to act. So that could be, if you want to think about it like a metropolitan twofer, so they're getting, and it could be offices that don't typically talk to each other. So that kind of connection between what those goals are for the New York Department of Environmental Protection and maybe the health department or whatever, those are pretty exciting opportunities.
Right. I can maybe just quickly respond to that and mention that there's some really interesting work going on now. In New York is a group that's doing very good research on comparing more traditional green roof technologies with these rooftop farms and understanding how they perform in terms of stormwater retention. Because that is the best source of funding for why you can get public funding for supporting the expansion of rooftop farming, for example. But also, from a selfish point of view, there's some really interesting research that architects are doing, in particular an office named here in Timberlake, Philadelphia, that just won an award for research they did in analyzing, I think, half a dozen of their own green roofs that they've built over the past 10 years. Going back and doing some post-occupancy analysis, where they studied how did the roof perform versus how it was designed. And they're finding a lot of interesting relationships between rooftop structures like skylights, bulkheads, and other architectural features and how they influence the performance of the green systems. So that's a really interesting point of view as well, an opportunity, I think, for us as designers to think about how ecology plays in this.
We have one more question over here.
I think it was a great lecture for Anna and Katherine, and I just wanted to ask both of you a question about the speed of design, actually both of this is being in a case study or be it in your house. The speed of design lies in the re-exoticization of the farm model, or the bucolic model. And it kind of reinforces the gravitas of phenomenons, right? It's like the bucolic model is now pollinated within the rooftop or within the wildland park. And I'm wondering if there is an alternative model of design that considers recontextualization to wildland park or to New York City instead of harping on the bucolic model of the farmhouse itself.
So the materials that we chose, and as I mentioned yesterday at the tour, were about sort of revealing all of the sort of essential parts, the building blocks of the garden itself. So we chose sort of transparent construction methods and materials. And I can't remember if I mentioned that in the talk. But it also has a sort of a down and dirty aesthetic, which was not all planned out. I went to a fancy design school, And before I came here, or before I came back into academia, I worked for really fancy, rich people, and I do a lot of like really pretty stuff. And I think pretty is actually really important, and I take it very seriously. But while the plants themselves are very pretty, I don't know that all of the detailing that we were using or the materials were so nostalgic. And that was also important. So, you know, the kind of the rusty rebar, which we ended up having to coat in clear paint so that kids didn't get rust on them. And we had to put little plastic covers on the ends of the pipes so that you didn't bang your head and, you know, scratch yourself and then get a, you know, major infection. You know, that was all kind of like, okay, this is affordable, it's here, there's stuff already here that you can use in your everyday life. Someone else talks about it every day, and so that was really part of that aesthetic. So I would argue that I was actually trying, I don't know, you can tell me how successful you think that was, but I was actually trying to counter the nostalgia of the sort of single-family home as represented in a very new urbanist style of housing that is being introduced in that neighborhood and partly funded by this university.
I'll just answer very quickly to wrap up. I think that the stage that it's at right now, there's only a handful of rooftop farms like this. I think it's unavoidable that there's a bucolic juxtaposition it's because it's a novelty. I mean, it's pretty cool and very unusual to go up to the 7th floor and you're on this farm and you're looking to the city. So I think that's unavoidable, but I don't know if it will, but if this phenomenon were to continue to expand and to become even commonplace, just like there are many different manifestations of community gardens with all sorts of design ethos present, I think that could eventually come to the rooftop as well. When we get over the shock of the sort of unexpected new kind of space. There'd be opportunity for design to enter into that integrated room.
Well, I think we better wrap it up.